a week into the Trump administration, realized that I was going to have to speed up timelines on when I wanted to leave Big Law. I believe now 7 or 8 other associates from capitulating firms have resigned publicly. And I know of a lot of people who have resigned privately. The compulsion is, am I being honest with myself about what I need to do?
Welcome to episode 245 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse Fascism works to unite all who can be united to join in mass nonviolent protest and resistance in the streets and throughout society, growing to include millions and refusing to stop until we create such a profound political crisis that Trump cannot impose his fascist program or even maintain his hold on power. I want to thank our patrons, our sustainers who make the show possible. Join our community today for as little as $2 a month at patreon.com/refusefascism. Thanks to everyone sharing the show, everyone who buys our merch to support and spread the show. See the show notes to get sticker packs, t-shirts, and more. A special thank you to those who rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, rating on Spotify, or whatever your listening platform of choice is. It boosts the show so much. I want to share as proof that we read everyone one such review from this past week from Rank and File Union member over on Apple Podcast. They titled their review "A Must Listen," gave us 5 stars. Thank you very much. And wrote, "Refuse Fascism is essential listening and a call to action to stand in solidarity against and defeat the Trump regime and fascist MAGA cult. Great resource for the people to aid in learning about the fascist Trump regime and how to organize and defeat this threat to democracy, our collective freedom, and our freedom to be our true selves. Highly recommended. An injury to one is an injury to all. Solidarity." Fist emoji, heart hands emoji. Thank you so much, Rank and File Union member. And to everyone else, after listening, please share your thoughts to help others find this urgent resource. As you can probably tell, my voice is a bit hoarse from yesterday's protest, and I want to send lots of love to everyone who was in the streets yesterday across the country, especially the thousands who marched with me in Washington, D.C., from the Washington Monument to the White House, demanding the Trump fascist regime must go now. Go to our social media at Refuse Fascism for sights and sounds from that protest, and from some of the other protests that Refuse Fascism was part of across the country.
Must go now! Trump must go now! Trump must go now! Trump must go now!
We're here today to say, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. The Trump fascist regime must go, and we're here to demand that Kilmar Abrego Garcia be released.
In today's show, we're sharing an interview with attorney Rachel Cohen, who resigned publicly from Skadden, a prestigious big law firm, in protest of the firm's capitulation to Trump's attacks. But first, this week in fascism. The advance of fascism has taken a major leap. Anyone who Trump deems a threat or an enemy, or anyone who is simply swept up by accident, could be disappeared, to rot or be tortured in a concentration camp in the jungle of El Salvador until they die. This is not a drill. This is a pivotal juncture in the consolidation of a Trump fascist America. Last week, the Supreme Court ruled that the Trump administration must take steps to facilitate the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a legal U.S. resident who was wrongfully and unlawfully deported by the admission of Trump officials to the CCOT concentration camp in El Salvador. And yet, they are refusing to comply. Trump is openly defying the Supreme Court, refusing to bring Kilmar home and making clear their intent to send anyone they don't like, including U.S. citizens, there next. This isn't just one case. It is a dramatic leap in fascist consolidation. As Georgetown law professor and previous guest of the show, Stephen Vladeck, warned, the assertion that, quote, the government can disappear people to a foreign country with no due process and no responsibility for what happens next, end quote, amounts to, quote, unquote, a rule of law crisis. Look, if they can do it to Abrego Garcia, they can do it to anyone. This is something that was spoken to very powerfully on the April 17th episode of the Ezra Klein Show. Listen to Klein and his guest, Asha Rangappa.
The emergency is here. The crisis is now. It's not 6 months away. It's not another Supreme Court ruling from happening. It is happening now. Maybe not to you, not yet, but to others, to real people whose names we know, whose stories we know. The President of the United States is disappearing people to an El Salvadoran prison for terrorists. A prison known by its initials, CCOT. A prison built for disappearance. A prison where there is no education or remediation or recreation, because it is a prison that does not intend to release its inhabitants back out into the world. It is a prison where the only way out, in the words of El Salvador's Justice Minister, is in a coffin. To the Trump administration, Abrego Garcia is not a mistake. He's a liability, and he's a test. A test of their power to do this to anyone. A test of whether the loophole they believe they have found, a loophole where if they can just get you on a plane, then they can hustle you beyond our laws and leave you in the grips of the kind of gulags they wish that they had here.
Does that include potentially U.S. citizens fully naturalized immigrants?
They're not ashamed of this. They're not denying their desire to do it to more people.
Yeah, that includes them. What, do you think there's a special category of person? They're as bad as anybody that comes in. We have bad ones, too. And I'm all for it. Because we can do things with the president for less money and have great security.
We are not even 100 days into this administration, and we are already faced with this level of horror. And I can feel the desire to look away from it, even in me. What all this demands is too inconvenient, too disruptive. But Trump has said it all plainly and publicly. He intends to send those he hates to foreign prisons beyond the reach of U.S. law. He does not care. He will not even seek to discover if those he is sending into these foreign hells are guilty of what he claims, because this is not about their guilt. It is about his power.
I think this is just a consolidation of power. This is arrogating authorities from Congress, which, as I mentioned before, it's already kind of seating on its own, and now arrogating powers from the judiciary. I mean, effectively what the Trump administration is doing is actually acting as a quasi-judiciary, right? They're rounding up people and effectively being judge, jury, and executioner. And they're just saying, look, trust us. We've decided that this person is guilty, that this person is a terrorist, that this person violated the law. So it's a consolidation of power. It's an authoritarian move. And I think the challenge is, who's going to stop us?
Trump intends to send those he hates to torture camps beyond the reach of U.S. law. This regime is asserting that it is above the law, that Trump is the law. The courts have no independent enforcement mechanism. They have no army. With Trump's fascist in control of Congress, there is no force within the ruling structures that can stop him. And as Trump threatens U.S. citizens saying, quote unquote, the homegrowns are next, we must see the writing on the wall, and we must be the force that stops him. Yeah, this is a 5-alarm emergency. The stakes could not be higher. If Trump can defy the courts and disappear people with impunity, no one is safe. He is testing whether he can lock down fascist rule, create an American nightmare in which immigrants are demonized and locked away, due process is abolished, dissent is criminalized, and his power through brute force knows no bounds. This is happening at the same time. They are advancing on every front their fascist agenda. Trump and the MAGA regime is accelerating its attacks on every institution, universities, law firms, nonprofits. Whole groups of people, 1,000 student visas revoked, violent ICE raids, ICE Gestapo pulling people out of their cars, U.S. citizens being held by local police on ISIS command, and the environment being threatened, disregarding law to threaten habitats of endangered species. All of this, part of cementing in a fascist America. But people are stirring, understanding what is at stake. The over 1 million that protested on April 5th, the thousands who took to the streets yesterday on April 19th, and hundreds who came out to the courthouse in Maryland for Kilmar Abrego Garcia this past week, and those who boldly, courageously challenged their legislator at town halls all week long, including at Senator Graisley's town hall in Iowa.
Are you going to bring that guy back from El Salvador? Yeah. Why not?
Well, because that's not a power of Congress.
The Supreme Court said to bring him back.
We would like to know what you, as the people, the Congress, who are supposed to rein in this dictator, what are you going to do about it? These people have been sentenced to life imprisonment in a foreign country with no due process. Our government cannot do anything.
This week, the U.S.'s oldest, richest, most prestigious university, Harvard University, refused to surrender to demands from the Trump regime that would have given the government control over whom it hired and admitted and what it taught. The Trump regime said on Monday that it planned to freeze $2.2 billion in grants and $60 million in multi-year contract value to Harvard. Hours after, Alan Garber, the president of Harvard University, said he wouldn't accept a series of demands made by the Trump regime. This development of Harvard not surrendering, not giving in, is extremely important. It needs to be joined by many others. You may not have had David Brooks quoting Marx and calling for civil uprising on your 2025 bingo card, but New York Times columnist David Brooks did just that this past week, stating, quote, "It's time for a comprehensive national civic uprising. It's time for Americans in universities, law, business, nonprofits, and the scientific community, and civil servants and beyond to form one coordinated mass movement. Trump is about power. The only way he's going to be stopped is if he's confronted by some movement that possesses rival power," end quote. For those who which this resonates, read, sign, spread A Call to Conscience, A Call to Act from refusefascism.org in the show notes. It's worth noting that Brooks's piece also noted the work by Erica Chenoweth and Maria J. Stefan, their book, Why Civil Resistance Worked, looking at nonviolent uprisings, and that he ended his piece with, "We have nothing to lose but our chains." You can see the show notes for his full op-ed. The awakening in society to what we are facing can and must spread quickly. We know there becomes a time when it is too late, and with the timeline we're in, not even 100 days in, and they are disappearing people. That time is going to come sooner rather than later. Now is the time to act. More people are seeing we can't rely on the courts, the highest of which is stacked by fascists, and which Trump doesn't feel bound to respect, or by elections, which will be too late, also the results of which Trump does not feel bound to respect should he come out the loser. It's up to us. We have a fighting chance to defeat Trump MAGA fascism with a powerful, nonviolent mass movement and a single unifying demand. Trump must go now. I want to share a quote from Frederick Douglass. Although over 100 years old, this quote, it's profoundly relevant to the moment we're in. The skin that we need to put in the game, the feathers that need to be ruffled, the demand that we must make. He wrote, quote, "Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are people who want crops without plowing the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the roar of its many waters. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." And so we need right now to be disrupting with this demand, to be creating a political crisis throughout the institutions, throughout all of society, raising this demand in the streets, in our millions and millions, such that Trump cannot govern, cannot implement his fascist program, can't even maintain his hold on power. The people of South Korea showed us how, yet again, on how you get rid of a tyrant. You get in the streets, you rise up, you keep coming back. The other side comes out, the regime ups their attack, and you don't back down. You grow, and you don't stop, and the whole world takes note, and you create a political crisis where in that case, in South Korea, the leader was impeached and indicted. But we have a legacy in this country too. Look at the ending of segregation in the United States. At the beginning of the 60s, building on decades of difficult, dangerous, and thankless struggle and sacrifice on the part of many, many Black people across the South, hundreds of college students became freedom riders, moving to the poorest and most brutally oppressed parts of the South, knowingly entering a lion's den full of racist sheriffs and rabid white supremacists, shrouded with impunity, in order to dismantle the Jim Crow system of segregation. Unlike the Black residents of these towns, for these students, facing this danger was a choice. And they not only made that choice, but committed to it day after day. 3 were lynched and murdered, many others maimed and beaten. And they did not only stay, but they continued in their work that was essential to ultimately ending Jim Crow. So we're all being asked, if you have a red line, where is it? And how many times have you moved it? The cost of sacrifice doesn't go down with time. It won't get easier later. The time to act is not at some future time. The time is now to fight with all we've got to stop a regime that imperils humanity and the planet itself. With that, I want to invite you to Refuse Fascism emergency assemblies taking place next Sunday, April 27th in New York City, Chicago, and LA. Organize, strategize, mobilize, and demand the Trump fascist regime must go now. Your creativity, your talents, your connections, your resources, yes, are all needed. Register today at refusefascism.org. The awakening in society to what we're facing can and must spread quickly. This is a moment to seize. So join an emergency assembly of people who share your desire to get on a mission to defeat Trump MAGA fascism. Everyone who knows this regime is fascist and must go now is needed to galvanize millions into the kind of mass struggle that is needed and, yes, indeed possible. Be part of spreading far and wide this essential slogan and demand, no, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. The Trump fascist regime must go now. Again, register at refusefascism.org or see the show notes. Now, here is my interview with Rachel Cohen. Major law firms have provided important free legal assistance to oppose fascist moves like the Muslim ban or suing to stop Trump's attempt to steal the 2020 election. However, one by one, Trump is targeting these law firms, and too many have capitulated, pledging, it's probably more than this now, but over $940 million in free legal services to whatever fascist cause Trump assigns them. And perhaps more important, every lawyer and law firm now fears getting on the wrong side of this regime by defending the wrong person or saying the wrong thing. Today, we're joined by Rachel Cohen, an attorney who organized hundreds of associates to sign onto an open letter that called on big law to respond to Trump's executive orders designed to sanction, at that time, 3 prominent firms. The letter was signed by more than 300 associates. Rachel then boldly and publicly resigned from her position at prestigious Skadden Arps. And in her powerful resignation letter, Rachel wrote, "Colleagues, if you question if it is as bad as you think it is 10 times worse." End quote. These words have sparked a national conversation, but for many of us, especially those listening to this show, they confirm what we've already seen. The legal profession, like many other institutions, has not just failed to stop Trump and the MAGA movement, it's enabled and normalized them. In today's conversation, we'll dig into what Rachel has learned from this process and what made her speak out, what it means to refuse to collaborate with fascism, even at a personal cost. Welcome, Rachel. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Sam.
First off, tell us more about your resignation and the actions you've taken since.
Absolutely. That's something that I'm very comfortable speaking on. And it's been kind of a whirlwind. It hasn't even been a full month yet. We're recording this on April 18th, and I submitted my resignation on the evening of March 20th. Sometimes people ask how the last X number of weeks of my life have been going, and I don't really remember any of them because things are moving too quickly, I think, for me to really record those memories. I appreciate you highlighting the open letter because prior to my submission of my resignation, I and other associates were really actively involved in internal organizing. I assume, given the general demographics of your listeners, that there will be even a pre-question of why on earth would one expect that an institution that's so profit motivated as to turn billions of dollars in profits doing representation for many of the worst corporations in the country, why do we care? What's the point here? And I think that that's a very fair question, but also one that I'm super prepared to answer. Associates are organizing on these topics as they're happening because these firms have spent the last X number of years, decades even, saying, we have this adversarial legal system and we're very well compensated within it. And what that means is that sometimes we're going to do representation that we don't even agree with or that you don't agree with, young associates that are coming here because of your debt burden or whatever else. And now at the moment where it is most important that they stand up for that notion that our adversarial legal system requires there be representation across the board, they're failing to meet that moment, despite the fact that from a collective action perspective, this was a really easy one. And we've seen big law firms, people love to say that it's unprecedented that firms would come together on any form of collective action, but that's actually really not true. There's been a lot of kind of universal condemnation when Roe was overturned, for example, or even more recently, and I think speaking of supporting fascism, there was a letter sent by many, many major law firms signed with the firm's name condemning anti-Semitism on college campuses following the kind of encampments that we saw sprouting up at the end of 2023 and beginning of 2024. To be clear, and again, guessing who your listeners are, perhaps I don't need to do this, but to prevent any type of kind of splicing of conversations, we're all very much against anti-Semitism, but the way and timing that these things came out was really meant to punish students for peaceful speech related to the Palestinian cause. So I've taken it quite far back now to, I think, just hope that I preempt the question that I assume is many people's top of mind question before they keep listening here. We've begun doing this organizing because, as stated, we thought it was very ripe for collective action and rooted in things that firms have said previously. Not because we inherently expected them to do the right thing or similar, but because it was something that we could point to and say, look, you've said these things for so long. You do all of this pro bono work. You say that you care about these things and the system and the institutions. And then we're just met with silence. And once people finally really started speaking, credit where it's due to Perkins Coie, initially targeted, and the first executive order, though Covington and Burling, a different corporate law firm, had been the target of Trump's ire beforehand as well. Perkins Coie fights this executive order, which has all of these kind of enforcement mechanisms that are meant to force it out of business and to really intimidate this firm and its partners. And then they come after Paul Weiss, which is another large corporate law firm run by very prominent Democrats. Brad Karp, the executive chairman, is a big Democratic fundraiser. Jay Johnson, who I believe he was the secretary of something, I apologize, under the Obama administration. And then Loretta Lynch, who was prominent in the Obama administration as well, are both partners there. And Paul Weiss just rolls over and gives the Trump administration all of this money to put towards, they claim pro bono they're already doing, but you and I and all your listeners know, as does the New York Times now, that that's not how this is playing out. It's not how anyone reasonably could have expected it to play out. And at that point, it became clear to me that there was not internal advocacy that was going to be effective in this moment, particularly not done without a major kind of change in broader conversation. And so I resigned and wasn't expecting this degree of change in broader conversation, but here we are.
Thank you for that breakdown and pulling back the lens a little bit for us. You wrote a lot of your motivations in your resignation letter, which was incredibly heartfelt and more honest than I think most people regularly do in their resignations, especially public resignations. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to reflect any more since then on how you would describe that compulsion that you felt that you couldn't partake and that you had to resign.
The compulsion is, am I being honest with myself about what I need to do? Because I think so many people in law firms right now, I don't think everyone needs to quit in this exact moment, but I think there will come a time where everyone really needs to quit. And I think that many of them will not. And I think it comes down to kind of this fundamental need for us all to recognize where our own self-mythology of ourselves as good and moral people is being disproven by facts and our own actions. And I think that one of the things that people in big law do often is tell themselves, well, you know, I've already sold out. I've already made my peace with doing these unethical things. And I think even people externally from big law say that, well, they've already sold out. They've already done these things. That hasn't been the major response that I've gotten to the decisions that I've made. But there have certainly been people calling very publicly quitting this job performative because I was willing to do work for corporations that I didn't agree with. And I think that it's really a desire to bury our heads in the sand about the reality of what's happening, which is not just the kind of fascist overreach that I think we have been seeing in the United States for a long time, but really true authoritarian consolidation of power that makes it almost impossible to hope that institutions will effectively be able to hold the line. I think that when all the data is pointing that a moral person wouldn't make, if you took yourself out of the situation and you would immediately have the right answer of how you have to act, that is the compulsion that usually guides me. And if I'm turning something over in my head a lot, that's a good sign I need to keep turning it over. And then I'll reach a point where I have to kind of just take myself out of it. I didn't fight to get into all of these spaces in order to not use my voice when it was the most important.
You took a stand that came with real personal risk. And I'm wondering, what has the reaction been like inside the profession and beyond?
Overwhelmingly grateful and supportive and positive. I joke most of my life I've spent being kind of not the furthest left person in the room always, but very much in the 10% furthest left space. And the person that's kind of getting thanks for raising that, Rachel. We're going to still do it our way instead. And it's been quite overwhelming to suddenly be someone that the majority of people are listening to, and to make sure, honestly, that I stay kind of guided by my own values in that and figuring out where the lines are in terms of what's a resource worth engaging in because of the doors that it opens versus one that is ultimately just not even going to be useful because we're too far apart from each other for any type of long-term organizing. But people have been inside Skadden specifically, inside the industry. I was shockingly popular on the Big Law Reddit. It took me, I think, a full week for people to start getting annoyed with me on our Big Law. And that was when I really knew that I had cracked some mainstream appeal. And once they finally got annoyed with me, I was like, okay, all's right in the world. We're back where things should be. But it's been really overwhelming positively.
That's so wonderful. That's so great. I wanted to ask you a little bit about other acts of resistance that you've seen within the legal community that your act inspired. I've seen some. Maybe you feel like it wasn't your act that inspired them, and I guess I'll accept that if that's how you feel. But sometimes you need someone to stand up for you to stand up to. So I just wanted to get your feel on other acts from the legal community that you think are worth noting that have happened in the past month.
I think that there's so much organizing and action that I will say I don't think that I directly inspired. But the one that I will take is that I believe now 7 or 8 other associates from capitulating firms have resigned publicly. And I know of a lot of people who have resigned privately, because I think that it's important to note that there are some firms. So I guess I'll only speak for myself. For me personally, a week into the Trump administration, realized that I was going to have to speed up timelines on when I wanted to leave Big Law, because I had made my peace. Not my peace, but I had come to terms with the fact that I would have to do certain work within Big Law, but knowing that government restrictions on certain things were going to be massively rolled back. I did finance work, and so the types of projects that are being built out, I just saw today, for example, that they're opening huge areas of oceanic wildlife preserves to commercial fishing, for example. And so the capitalism of it all is going to be driving places to invest in expanding things that I already did not agree with when they had significant limits on how they could expand. So a week into the Trump admin, I realized I'd been thinking maybe I'll stay through the end of the year. I need to speed that up. I'm exhausted all the time. I don't have time to engage in organizing in the way that I would like to. Let me get ready to leave when I have to leave. If you're leaving publicly, that is kind of where you have to be. But lots of people are leaving and saying, okay, maybe I'm not ready to leave the industry altogether, so let me go to a Perkins, let me go to Williams & Connolly, let me go to a firm that is fighting these things, or go to a corporation in-house that I don't deeply agree with, but don't disagree with to this extent. When you do that, you can't post on LinkedIn condemning the entire industry, right? And you certainly can't do this much media, which is, I think, one of the other reasons why I'm everywhere all of the time, is that when I sent that resignation, was not expecting, oh, maybe I'll go to a different big law firm that's reacting to the moment a little bit differently. We have seen many people resign over this, publicly or privately. And that, I do think, needed someone to be first and to be public. And that's something that I have a lot of pride in, because even if we cap here and there's high single-digit number of people that went through with public resignations from these firms, that I don't think has ever happened in the industry before, even at that very small level, let alone as organizing continues to build.
Really important point. Thanks for highlighting that. I think it's important to note for listeners that there are others in the firm that you were part of that did resign publicly. Brenna Trout-Frey, I'm not sure if I'm saying their name right, and Thomas Sipp were two that I'm aware of that did so publicly. Thomas did a letter that got picked up by Above the Law and was quite powerful, and Brenna did hers on LinkedIn. There might be others. One of the lines that stood out to me from Brenna's was, there's only one acceptable response from attorneys to the Trump administration's demands. The rule of law matters. The rule of law matters. As an attorney, if my employer cannot stand up for the rule of law, then I cannot ethically continue to work for them. And I just wanted to bring that in as a segue to a question that you had started off answering. What is Trump targeting when he is targeting the legal community? And related to that, how is he doing this and why?
Our justice system's not sua sponte. We live under this kind of common law adversarial system that was passed down. This kind of adversarial common law system is not super common outside of former British colonies. What that means is that the judge doesn't have a fact-finding role. They don't affirmatively bring cases in when injustice is seen. Other people, usually attorneys, bring cases on behalf of clients, and they're responsible for outlining the facts and for also making an argument that allows the judge to find in their favor. When we come after attorneys, any attorneys, even those who the majority of their practice is kind of corporate work, when we come after those people and say that they should be penalized for doing certain kinds of representation, especially that critical of the government or of the Trump administration or Donald Trump in a private capacity, that has a huge chilling effect on who's willing to bring cases. And the people in public interest's tolerance for the threat of lost profit or similar is always going to be higher than people who work in big law. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone to public interest. They would have often gone to big law if they were as profit motivated as people who did. The kind of bulwarks of attorneys in nonprofit spaces or who are full-time public interest, they have a higher tolerance, but the Trump administration is also coming after them and much more aggressively through things like reducing eligibility for public service loan forgiveness if you do certain types of work focused on immigration work and on often kind of work for free speech issues and to protect trans people. And he's also threatening what's called Rule 11 sanctions, which are sanctions that can put your license in jeopardy ultimately based off bringing frivolous lawsuits and alleging that a lot of immigration attorneys bring frivolous lawsuits or coach their clients to lie or similar. So he's coming after kind of all of these things at once. There's also an assault on the judiciary. And honestly, it didn't even occur to me a month ago, but now I think is becoming abundantly clear that this focus on immigration defense is not just related to people who are seeking asylum in this country or who are here on student visas, but is going to be used as pretext to ultimately come after attorneys that try to prevent U.S. citizens from being deported to this concentration camp that's set up in El Salvador, that's being built out at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. Down the line, we see where that is going. I think a lot of law firm partners would say that that's alarmist. And I do think that that's necessary in order to make the types of deals that you're making with. You have to convince yourself that that can't possibly be true. But it's not even really forward looking at this point. There are U.S. citizens in ICE detention right now. There are U.S. legal permanent residents that are being deported to this concentration camp that is in a country that's also run by a right-wing authoritarian regime. I made a TikTok yesterday about Bukele, just as an aside, and knew a lot about him because I've done immigration work in the past and worked with people from El Salvador and actually been to El Salvador. But I didn't realize until I was Googling it that in the last election, which he was not actually legally eligible for, there's supposed to be a one-term limit for presidents of El Salvador, and the Supreme Court of El Salvador granted him an exception so that he could run for re-election, and then he claimed that he won over 80% of the Salvadoran popular vote. I'm getting in the weeds. I'm just thinking about that a lot since I was looking at those numbers last night and how ridiculous it was that Western media was reporting them without saying how ridiculous that is. Anyway, we have the Trump administration kind of coming after all of these things to dismantle legal protections such as they are. And I am not a big institutionalist. I am not super, wow, the United States was great 2 months ago or 3 months ago or 8 years ago or anything else. But we do need protections of kind of these fundamental freedoms and these fundamental requirements of proof before the state can deprive you of these fundamental freedoms. I'm actually, and welcome listener feedback, but really trying to think about how to frame not totally focused on rule of law, which is not a Brenna. I also was using that language frequently. And then I kind of started to think about it and realized that I think in a couple of months to a couple of years, the laws are not going to be ones that I'm supportive of being enforced. And so I want to be careful with terminology there. But that's a very meandering answer. The TLDR, though you did just have to listen to all of it, is that we need lawyers to bring cases and to represent clients whose rights are being infringed upon. The outcomes for Kilmar Abrego Garcia have been horrific, despite incredibly effective representation. But the only reason that there are people with eyes on him, the only reason that I think he may be especially situated to survive this moment in El Salvador is because of effective advocacy by his attorneys.
Really important the way that you were bringing it together. It wasn't meandering, even if it felt that way. I thought that there was a lot of clarity there. This week, I've been thinking a lot about people's, in this country's, lack of understanding of this significance. I mean, there's a lot of people that do understand the significance. I don't want to undercut that. When you have friggin' David Brooks ending an op-ed basically calling for people to take to the streets with, we have nothing to lose but our chains, we definitely are in new territory. But I think that overall, most people, as sickened as they are by what's happening to Kilmar Abrego Garcia and the hundreds of men who have been dumped and locked away in this concentration camp, I think that there is lack of clarity on what an escalation this is. In my view, the consolidation of fascism, and where due process fits into that, and the right to lock anyone away for anything at any time, send them anywhere, like what that means in terms of what time it is for the type of action that's needed. I just really appreciated your underscoring of that. I'm wondering, with Big Law, they shape basically everything from legislation to elections. They play a very big role in this country. In the past month, how have they been responding to the attacks that you think people need to understand?
Big law firms, even those that I think are very admirably fighting back effectively on an individual level, big law firms are failing to grasp the gravity of the situation. I think there's been one or two firms that really seem to, in kind of a affirmative dedication to due process and norms and the adversarial legal system. But most of them, including those that are fighting, there's several firms that are fighting Trump executive orders and doing so quite effectively. They still were not out of the door supporting Perkins Coie, with the exception of a couple of very prominent and exceptional, in my opinion, litigation boutique firms that I think are run by people who did immediately grasp the gravity of the situation. But on the whole, if you get to the upper echelons of a big law firm like this one, you don't have a ton of time to consume the news and kind of connect the dots in this way. And you also are a big believer in institutions. I was hearing out of firms that did eventually end up challenging the Trump administration that the line internally was that they didn't want to stick their necks out and put themselves at risk, but that they would be ready to protect themselves when the time came. And it's just a fundamental misunderstanding of what the moment demands and what the moment is, where there is no, not to go all the way back to the oft-cited Ben Franklin quote, right? But you either hang together or you all hang separately. We had very little collective action outside of the associate level. By the time, I think that we're still probably getting some signatories. I handed off updating that letter to a friend of mine, and so I'm not following it super closely. But I think that as of a week or two ago, we were at something like 1,800 signatures from associates across the industry. Those are anonymized and not as effective as some might hope, but still pretty effective, especially when there's been a real lack of collective organizing in this industry for a very long time. It was getting covered by industry publications. It got picked up in Reuters and Politico. And so that's how uncommon collective action is in this industry. All of that to say, the firms had the opportunity to act collectively and they failed to do so. I am not defeatist. I think that we still need organizing internally. I think until the firms are really actively engaged in problematic representation, I do not think poorly of friends that have decided to stay, many of whom are currently in the process of leaving or trying to leave. But I do think that we will reach a point where it's necessary to leave in order to still have a kind of self-mythology of yourself as a good or moral person. And I think that one of the areas where I'm particularly concerned is in immigration representation. I think that's actually where firms have done some of the best pro bono work over the last several decades, because there's not the same degree of conflicts issues that can come from other forms of pro bono representation. And also, it was viewed as very apolitical or politically neutral to represent individual people who have always been vetted to have legitimate cases, vetted by pro bono partners who are full-time public interest attorneys or public interest organizations, to see if under international law, people qualify for some form of immigration relief in the United States. And so you have hundreds, if not thousands, of ongoing immigration cases taken by large corporate law firms. I would guess nationally that is probably in the mid thousands to tens of thousands of ongoing kind of immigration representation by law firm. There's one major law firm that requires, it pairs you your first year, you're required to pair up with another first year associate and take some form of immigration case. That is where firms have never expected to have to really stand up for that to be controversial. And they're going to start winding back. I've heard rumors that Kirkland and Ellis has started telling people they cannot take new immigration matters. And I'm concerned about moving towards a moment where firms start to drop their immigration clients altogether. All of that to say, I was just reading, because I've been running around a lot this last week. And so before we hopped on the phone, I was reading an article in NPR about the difficulty that organizations are finding, or the difficulty that organizations are having in finding big law partners on certain pro bono matters that typically would have been quite easy to staff a year ago. And immigration is where I am the most concerned. I looked yesterday at some poll where he still has majority approval about his treatment of migrants. And I think until we effectively meet the kind of fascist eugenicist rhetoric that exists on the right about migrants, I think that we will lose because they've been very effectively scapegoated by some really, really evil people. And by the time everyone realizes that the reason that you don't want to scapegoat people, even if your own soul will let you do that somehow, the reason that you don't want to say that it's okay for people to be subject to immense harm without process and protections and belief in their inherent humanity is because there's almost no one who's just protected in a vacuum if we allow that to happen to anyone.
Absolutely. It's the Niemöller quote brought to life.
Which I did often see just a couple of truly unhinged things that happen in the industry that made me realize that I had to get out of it to like continue to organize effectively. And one of them was someone posting that poem in our Big Law, but then it seems that people think that anonymously posting the First They Came poem is saying something. And I just don't think that's true. It's about action.
Absolutely. His second famous quote actually speaks more to this moment, and I'm going to butcher it because I don't have it in front of me, but in another less famous quote, there's the one where he talks about, if we had done this earlier, many of us would have died. Like if we had resisted earlier, many of us would have died, but think about how many we would have saved. I think that that's very apt in this moment of a time where like beyond risk adverse doesn't cut it in terms of how unwilling to sacrifice many people are in this country, but especially those in Big Law. But I think that that is one that speaks to it. I wanted to ask you a question that might seem like off from what we're talking about, hopefully not, but as the arbiter of the legal establishment in the US, one might think the Supreme Court might be positioned to intervene in defense of the rule of law. How has the fascist capture of the court with a 6-3 fascist majority shaped the landscape on which this struggle is playing out? Relatedly, what do you say to those who argue, let the courts handle it, as if this could be purely resolved through procedure?
The first thing that I usually say to people that make that argument is, will you read this thing that I'm writing and tell me where I'm losing you? Because I so fundamentally disagree with that notion that sometimes I can be overly strident or overly critical and lose people that might otherwise agree with me. However, I veer towards overly strident because I think that it's absolutely useless to wait for the court, the same way that I think it's useless to wait for the party to do anything. And I haven't come to any type of conclusion about what I think the most effective immediate path forward is in terms of leftist political organizing in this country, beyond that I think it's extremely important that we focus on local and state elections and advocacy, in addition to holding the federal party accountable. But the two-party system, it becomes almost impossible to argue about holding the Dems accountable if we don't have effective infrastructure built lower, because the Republican presidential candidate's always going to be worse. But I digress. I think the courts are not only not going to save us, but reliance on that rhetoric goes back kind of to the rule of law piece that I'm kind of thinking through right now, which is that we are very soon going to be in a moment where it is illegal to help someone access gender affirming care broadly, where it is illegal to help someone in getting an abortion. And it's very apparent to me how silent this administration has been on abortion because they saw the reaction of Dobbs. They're not going down paths to go back to the second Niemeyer quote that you just referenced, or Niemöller. I think the issue is that so many people want more confirmation that things are as bad as we say that they are. But by the time they get that confirmation is going to come from ICE agents busting down the doors of U.S. citizens that you know's home with guns and carting them off and shipping them to CCOT, which is likely a death camp already, and I'm sure it will be more obvious as a death camp by that time. The general person requesting more kind of confirmation is not brave enough to quit a job that pays $200,000 plus a year with all of their savings. What kind of deluded self-perception do you have that makes you think that you're going to be brave enough then? honestly, one of the reasons that I quit when I did was to force my own hand, because I don't know that I'm brave enough to speak up when that is what we're faced with. And I do believe that that's coming. It's like when you text someone and commit to party plans and you buy the ticket so that you force yourself to go instead of staying in. All right, I know how I think that I am. Let me make sure that this is actually how I am. Let me box myself in. I think the courts are not only not going to save us, reliance on rhetoric like that is going to make things worse, because it's going to be illegal to do the things that are just very soon, as has been the case many times in American and global history before. Where I do think I probably split with some people is that I don't think that it's worth kind of then saying, so let's abandon that kind of advocacy altogether, because I think that it's actually quite irresponsible to be a wealthy white accelerationist. I think I'm not going to be the person harmed by the immediate collapse of due process protections in the United States. And so I do think that there's some obligation to kind of fight to defend the imperfect systems that we have, at least until there is someone that is not so prone to genocide in office, so that when there's reconstructive efforts happening, they're going in the right direction.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I think that there can be a great deal of positive dynamism between people in the institutions, including legal institutions, fighting for the rights of people and defying the regime, and people in the streets refusing to accept a fascist America. The people in the streets giving backing and support to the people that are fighting in the courts. And vice versa, the fact that people are fighting in the courts, giving heart to people in the streets. That's how I see that one. We often hear concern about norm erosion, but Trump is reshaping the legal landscape into a tool of vengeance. And what they're doing to big law being one example of that vengeance, but definitely by no means the only or main or primary. How do you think big law, or if you want to take it as the institutions more broadly, are prepared to experience that shift?
I don't think they're prepared at all. I've given one example of kind of the things that made me sure that I had to leave. And one of the other examples, I guess I probably have two here. One is when I was in a meeting with the managing partner of the Chicago office, kind of talking about my concerns here. And his response was to basically ask if it was better to wait until the administration changed. He literally, he's a nice enough guy, literally goes, but don't you think it's better, instead of us sticking our necks out there, if we wait until the admin changes and then this will all kind of sort itself out? And it was like that. If you're familiar with that meme of Jessica Lange from American Horror Story, where she says, there's not going to be a swimming pool, you stupid slut. I was sitting in the office, fighting the urge to pull that meme out on my phone. They are so unprepared for the moment. I ultimately clicked send because he and the executive partner of the entire firm, I'm sitting, Paul Weiss has made this deal. My mind's racing. It's been racing for weeks on what I need to do and what we all need to do and what we owe each other. And I looked, and both of them were idle on the internal system. And I was like, you know what? If this is how not seriously we're taking this, that we're not even logged in trying to figure out what to do here, I'm reading this right, and they are not prepared for the moment. But I think that many people want to hope that there's some type of backdoor preparedness plan that's happening. And every once in a while, we're right. And that's why it's really important, I think, to ask around and see who's doing the work. Is someone actually doing this? Every once in a while, you're pleasantly surprised. But most of the time, you're not. 15 to 20 minutes later, they were both in a meeting. So that was helpful, at least. But they are as unprepared as you think that they are, if not more, because they don't want to have to grapple with the realities that would be necessary to grapple with in order to be prepared.
And then that feeds into enabling the fascism to smoothly advance and gobble up good people as part of it.
Or even directly supporting the fascism, because you can't let yourself believe that it's this type of authoritarianism, in which case you're willing to accept the premise that this is a political issue as opposed to a real existential threat to all of our existence. some more immediately than others, but eventually all of us.
Absolutely. As we close out the conversation, I wanted to bring up your latest piece where you talk about the potential power of the next generation of lawyers, those graduating from law school in these times, but also younger associates. What do you say to others, especially young lawyers or students who don't want to be part of this collaboration, but don't see the ways to resist?
I think, and this is something that's very overwhelming, and so I want to be very gentle when I say this, but I think that if you're not seeing someone doing the type of work that you wish someone was doing, sometimes that does have to be you a little bit. I'm getting a lot of individual outreach saying, okay, now Rachel, tell me how to help. And I'm having to decline all of those. I don't have the time in the day to get on the phone, despite spending quite a bit of time going through them, where I've had upwards of 5,000 LinkedIn requests for the last month because they just keep stacking. I think that where I am likely to respond is when people say, this is the idea that I have. This is what I think we should do. This is how I've started it. And the coalition that I have, then I respond. Or I try to. Sometimes I still don't, but that's despite best efforts. I think that it's very easy to feel overwhelmed if you do not have a cohesive theory of change. And I think that it can feel quite silly in this moment to say to yourself, I need to read theory and build my community and figure out who my true and deep friends are. And so people put off doing it. But right now you can still do those things. And they're going to be just unbelievably important in the near future, and probably not particularly easy to do in the near future, or at least not to do safely. I think that it is constantly a battle against hopelessness and disillusionment. And I understand those sentiments, and cyclically there have been times where I am deeply hopeless and disillusioned. But I think that the most important thing that you can do is build your community and read about the people that are already doing this work. In case there are people listening to that specifically, I would say that the thinkers that have had the greatest impact on my own organizing, it's probably specifically Mariame Kaba. I find her work really accessible and bite-sized. And she has 2 books that I've read that are Let This Radicalize You, and then We Do This Till We Free Us, that are abolitionist lenses. And you might not agree with all. There's 1 or 2 essays where I don't even find them 100% resonant for me personally. But I think that her kind of grassroots community-based theories of change and abolition and reluctance to pedestal individuals is something that I find extremely compelling and helpful in terms of guiding where to start.
I want to thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience, your expertise, your perspectives, and of course, your time with us, Rachel. And I'm wondering if there's anything that we didn't discuss that you want to share with listeners.
I don't think so. I'm really grateful for the conversation and appreciative of kind of your core listener base. So happy to stay in touch. And thanks so much again for having me.
And for those who want to read Rachel's letter, you can see the show notes along with her open letter that she was part of organizing. I know you're inundated with people messaging you, but are there other public-facing ways that you are engaging with people? And I totally forgot to ask, very important question, what is next for you in your own journey?
Oh, God, next steps are going to be so dependent on what the United States looks like. So we're still figuring that out. And it's also, I have runway, I have savings, I had vacation days that paid out, and I don't have any interest in moving on to something until I am sure that I have wrung every drop of utility out of myself in this particular moment. And I think that so few people, to maybe your last question about people that are feeling overwhelmed or similar, so few people get the opportunity to all of a sudden, basically overnight, get to be a voice that people are listening to and taking seriously on a national level. And I think that too often when that does happen, or even a smaller version of that happens, I think that we're kind of rushed into the next thing. I'm not running for office in 2026. Imagine the inauthenticity of coming out and saying there's an authoritarian takeover and I've decided to combat it by primarying Dick Durbin in 2026. Like, a couple of people have commented that to me, mostly very successful people. Like, it's so impressive how authentic you've managed and you're not grandstanding. And I don't think I've ever seen that. Well, it's because most people grandstand when they get into a position like this. It's very hard not to. I'm sure I'm doing it in some ways, and I'm struggling to figure out where the lines of those things are. But I will say that leads me into actually where people can stay in touch, which is we're building out like a personal email list. My friends and I, no one's employed for me, but a lot of people are spending a lot of time helping me, and I'm very grateful. So that is a bit.ly/Rachel Cohen contact, RACHELCOHEN, and then Rachel Cohen contact are all capitalized. There's a lot of information you can add, but you only need to put your name and email address and then whatever else you'd like to share. But should have a public-facing newsletter that we were really trying to start today that's really going to start next week. And then I have been active on TikTok for a really long time, actually, at Cohen489. And Instagram, you're more likely to actually see my stuff. That's Cohen.489 because on one of them, the other one was taken. So people can stay in touch there, and I don't know next steps, but I'll be around.
Wonderful. Again, thank you so much, Rachel, for all you're doing and for continuing to use your voice at this urgent moment.
Thanks so much, Sam. Have a good one.
Same to you. Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. If you're in the Northeast of the United States, I hope to see you at the Refuse Fascism Emergency Assembly next Sunday, April 27th in New York City. Register at refusefascism.org or see the show notes. Organizing assemblies are also taking place in Chicago and LA, so be sure to check out the website for more information and to register. Read, sign, and spread a call to conscience, a call to act, a powerful tool to orient and organize the millions it will take to drive this regime from power. And if you want to support the show, so glad. Spread the imperative and support the show by getting merch, see the show notes. Join our Patreon community to fuel refusal of this fascist nightmare at patreon.com/refusefascism, or make a one-time donation by visiting refusefascism.org and hitting the donate button, or give via Venmo at refuse-fascism. If money is tight, totally understand. There are ways to support for $0. Share the show with others, rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, or comment on our socials or YouTube. It makes a difference and is so appreciated. Connect with us on social media at Refuse Fascism, including on Blue Sky, or find us on TikTok at Refuse Fascism, FASHISM. To get around TikTok's rules, we had to change the spelling. As always, thanks to Richie Marini, Lena Thorne, and Mark Tingelman for helping produce this episode. Thanks to incredible volunteers, we have transcripts available for each show, so be sure to visit refusefascism.org and sign up to get them in your inbox. Until next Sunday, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.